Tonight's invited scientist and speaker is Coltan Scrivner, as I mentioned before. He's a PhD candidate in the Department of Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago, and a fellow at UChicago's Institute for Mind and Biology in the Behavioral Biology Lab. His current research centers around how we react to potentially dangerous, socially or physically situations and individuals. We've invited him here tonight because Scrivner is interested specifically in how and why we find enjoyment from fictionally dangerous scenarios, as well as the phenomenon of morbid curiosity. Scrivner's research on the psychology of horror and morbid curiosity has been covered by media and news outlets including New Scientist, National Geographic, the Chicago Tribune, The Guardian, the New York Times, Forbes, Nautilus, Vice, and SciComm. He's a busy guy. So typically what we do after a presentation is have a Q&A period, but the spirits of the theater are restless tonight, and we've had some technical issues. So we're patching Coltan in to deliver his presentation from the booth instead of down here, which means, unfortunately, we're not going to host our Q&A period. But Coltan has a great presence on the web, and you are welcome to reach out to him at coltanscrivner.com, where you can learn more about his work. And you can also, if you haven't done it already, assess yourself using the morbid curiosity scale that he developed. So if we do have a lag as we try to get Coltan up on the screen, you might be able to pull that up on your phone. It's pretty quick, and I know he's going to reference it in his presentation tonight. You can also follow his Psychology Today blog, Morbid Minds, where he explores all things spooky. So, without further ado.
Okay, awesome. Well, hello virtually from Chicago, but I'm very excited to be speaking with you today about the psychology of morbid curiosity and why this can help explain why Freddy haunts your nightmares, but also, more importantly, why you love it. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two things this evening. First, we'll talk about why does Freddy haunt our nightmares? So what is it about him that really works well to scare the audience? So why is he an effective horror monster? It's such an iconic horror monster. Once we understand something about why he haunts our nightmares, we'll talk a little bit about why we like it. So unlike characters in the film, we get some fun when Freddy is scary. So we'll look at two things first that make Freddy such an effective horror icon. So first we'll discuss his looks and his behaviors and see how these things tap into deeply rooted fears for humans. Now, let's start with his face. So Freddy's a great guy, right? Loves kids, has a great sense of fashion, and is in maybe many ways the man of your dreams. However, I think we can all agree that he probably wouldn't fare too well on dating apps like Tinder, because he really has the face that only a mother can love. So just like Jason's hockey mask, or Michael's distorted Captain Kirk mask, or whoever's Leatherface happens to be wearing that day, Freddy's face is iconic. And his burned and scarred face reminds us of his origins, but it also instills a sense of disgust and fear in the audience. And unlike some killers who hide their disfigurement with a mask, Freddy almost proudly displays his scars. And as scary as masks can be, sometimes facial disfigurement can strike as something deeper. So when you first looked at these photos, you probably had a similar reaction as to when you first saw Freddy's face. You likely experienced the emotion of disgust. Now you may also experience other kinds of emotions, maybe sadness or empathy, but photos of infected or diseased bodies reliably evoke disgust. And this occurs across the world. So why would this be? Well, just like you have, as many of you have probably become aware this year, you have an internal immune system that helps prevent and stop infections once they've already infected you. However, you also possess what's called the behavioral immune system. And the behavioral immune system functions to prevent you from getting sick in the first place. So it's the first line of defense between you and an infection. And the key feature of the behavioral immune system is pathogen avoidance. So for example, when you see something or smell something that could be caused by an infectious agent, you tend to make a particular kind of face. And the face looks something like this. You lower your eyebrows, you wrinkle your nose, you curve your lips a bit, and if the sight or the smell is particularly strong, you might gag a little. So this response cues you, but also anyone watching you, into the fact that something should be avoided because it could be pathogenic. Of course, most of this is subconscious, you're not actively thinking about these things as they're occurring. And that's actually a good thing. They're meant to be quick and to be efficient. And this means that they sometimes could, of course, be wrong or misfire. So for example, with Freddy's face, it's kind of a false flag. So there's nothing pathogenic about burned face. However, it does resemble a face that could have been scarred by an infection or is currently infected with something. So like many of our behaviors, the disgust response tends to err kind of on the side of safety. It's a bit like your smoke detector. So for example, it's better for your smoke detector to go off a few times while you're cooking than it is for it not to go off when there's actually a fire. So the cost of wrongly feeling disgusted is pretty low compared to the cost of not feeling disgusted when you should. And Freddy kind of hijacks this psychological tendency of the behavioral immune system. And he's not alone in this. Other horror monsters also take advantage of our disgust response in order to instill fear and avoidance. So the most classic case of this, of course, are zombies or the infected 28 days later. And zombies and the infected, they trigger our evolved response to pathogens. However, they are, of course, honest signals of infection because if you come into contact with them, you actually do become infected. And, as iconic as Freddy's face might be, even more iconic is his glove. And it's changed a bit over the years, but the essence has pretty much stayed the same. A leathery, skin-like glove with bladed fingers. And what's interesting about this is there are a lot more lethal weapons out there than a bladed glove. For example, if Freddy just had a handgun, the movie probably would have been about 15 minutes instead of 90 minutes. And he wouldn't need to do all that chasing. But then again, the chasing is kind of part of the point, as we'll talk about later. But even still, let's say he wanted to go with an up-close and personal weapon. There's still more lethal weapons than a bladed glove. So why does Freddy have a glove? Why is it so effective at eliciting fear? Why has this glove become so iconic? The simple answer is that Freddy's glove taps into deeply rooted fears of predators. In particular, our fears of sharp teeth and sharp claws. So although humans are often portrayed as being kind of the top of the food chain, it hasn't always been like that. So for much of human history and for current humans in many places, sharp teeth and sharp claws from predators are a problem. So humans and many of their primate relatives have been on the dinner menu for large carnivores for hundreds of thousands of years. And as with the disgust response, it's useful if you can kind of respond quickly to a predator without having to think about it. And it's better to mistakenly have the startle response than it is, and be ready to flee than it is to not have a startle response at all. And of course, there are many different kinds of predators, and humans throughout their life have learned how to distinguish what's dangerous from what's not dangerous, but we still often fall back on these deeper fears that are very deeply rooted. So things like sharp teeth and sharp claws are something that every predator has in common, at least predators to humans. And so it makes sense that this is kind of what our minds latch onto. It's what our attention is drawn to. When Freddy's on the screen, your attention is drawn to his glove. Because these are the parts of the predator that drive our fear responses. So Freddy takes advantage of that, right? His bladed glove instantly reminds us that he is a predator. And of course, he's not the only horror icon who has used this. In fact, you might have a hard time finding horror icons that don't use this. Ancient monsters like werewolves and Dracula rely on sharp teeth and sharp claws. Modern horror icons emulate this. So Pennywise has several rows of sharp teeth, a bit like a shark. Ghostface and Michael use knives. Jason uses a machete. Victor Crowley has a hatchet. And Leatherface has a chainsaw. In each case, the monster is using some kind of bladed weapon, something that resembles sharp teeth and sharp claws. And in each case, the weapon is really not that great if you're just trying to kill someone. So a chainsaw is a really bad weapon for chasing someone. It's heavy, it's loud, it can run out of gas, but because it's big and because it's loud, and most importantly, because it's sharp, it's effective at inducing fear. It subconsciously reminds us in that case that Leatherface is a predator. And Wes Craven understood the importance of primal fears when he created Freddy. In an interview about the origins of Freddy's glove, Craven said that part of it was an objective goal to make the character more memorable, since it seems that every character that has been successful has had some kind of unique weapon, whether it was a chainsaw or a machete or something else. Craven went on to say that he was looking for a primal fear, something that's embedded in the subconscious of people of all cultures. And one of those is the claw of an animal, like a saber-toothed tiger reaching out with its tremendous hooks. And so he just transposed this onto the human hand. So even though Wes Craven is not a scientist or didn't study human psychology, he is, like many great horror writers and horror directors, someone who understands the psychology of fear. And it's helped him create a horror icon. So with regards to his looks, Freddy gives us sort of a 1-2 punch that makes him an effective haunter. So his face triggers deeply rooted fears of disgust or feelings of disgust. And this leads the audience to feel revulsion each time his face makes an appearance on the screen. His bladed glove taps into evolved primal fears relating to predators, and combined with long chase scenes that are common to all slasher films, the audience is primed to fear Freddy in a way that's kind of difficult to shape. However, it's not all about looks when it comes to Freddy. So his behaviors also tap into some deeply rooted psychological triggers that signal to us that he's evil and dangerous. Of course, the obvious one that I don't need to go over is that he's a literal serial killer. But this alone doesn't trigger powerful feelings of fear. So let's go over a few of the things that Freddy does that do trigger our deepest fears. Now, like most slasher villains, Freddy is a pretty effective stalker. He often hides in the shadows, in a foggy boiler room, or he takes the shape of other people or other objects. And most importantly, he stalks his victims when they are at their most helpless, in their dreams. So Freddy's victims can run, but they can never truly hide from him. Because in the dream world, Freddy is inescapable. And that's what makes him kind of the ultimate predator in this case. His ability to sneak up on his victims is virtually unimpeded. And unlike some killers, he kind of likes to toy with his victims so that he can continue preying. Because for Freddy, it's not the blood or the kill count that really matters. He's not doing it to fulfill some greater purpose. Freddy just kills people because it's the fear that feeds him. So creative stalking is really key to his ability to scare us and also his ability to thrive. So, as he's toying with his victims, Freddy loves to laugh. He's pretty much the master of the evil laugh. And you can find supercuts on YouTube of Freddy laughing at all the protagonists across the entire Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. And although the evil laugh is pretty common to a lot of villains, Freddy is really the only classic slasher, the only horror slasher that uses evil laughter to convey just how evil he is. So to better understand why the evil laugh is so important to Freddy's persona, we need to understand something first about regular laughter. So the science behind laughter is a little bit convoluted, but scientists tend to agree that laughter serves primarily a social function. So it signals to other individuals that whatever one's doing at the time of the laughter is all in good fun, right? It's the signal of play. So this is really important when you're pushing boundaries of things like social norms or fear. So for example, kids tend to laugh when they play scary games like tag or hide and seek. Of course, tag doesn't seem like a scary game on its face, but if you think about it, especially for a kid, it's really just a game of predator and prey, right? It's someone chasing another person. And kids tend to laugh, but also scream when they're doing this. And the laughter during this kind of game or this kind of play is really important because it signals that the other things that are going on, like the screaming, shouldn't be taken too seriously and are really all just part of play. So the laughter signals play, but also kind of intrinsic enjoyment at some situation. It tends to be involuntary, right? Sometimes you can't help but laugh. So it tends to be a pretty honest signal of enjoyment. And other animals, though they don't really laugh per se, there are some similar behaviors. So anyone who has a dog has probably seen something like what the dog here on the right is doing. And laughter is a bit like a dog bowing and wagging his tail during rough and tumble play. He may be growling and aggressively playing with a toy, but the bowing position, the wagging tail, kind of shows other dogs and savvy humans that he's simply playing. So this means that laughter can be understood as this largely involuntary signal of play and of intrinsic enjoyment at whatever's happening. And so a colleague of mine, a media scholar named Jens, has been doing some really interesting work on what he calls evil laughter. And so he's shown that villains use the signaling aspect of laughter to actually convey how evil they are, instead of how much fun they're having. Or in this case, they do, I guess, a little of both. So for example, a villain will describe plans to harm the protagonist, or maybe they see the protagonist currently in harm's way, and they just let out a big evil laugh. And this conveys to the protagonist, but also to the audience, that the villain or the monster enjoys and is sort of intrinsically motivated by the prospect of causing harm. So it removes any doubt that a harmful action might be accidental or have some source other than just pure pleasure. So, for example, a bank robber, let's say, who laughs before shooting a bank teller and taking money, seems more evil than a robber who just shoots the bank teller and leaves. And this is because we can envision, a bank robber needing the money for something. Let's say he needs the money for his dying mother, and that's why he's robbing the bank. That's kind of difficult to do if he laughs right before he shoots the teller, because the laugh signals to us that the bank robber is really enjoying causing harm and enjoying being evil. And of course, Freddy gives us plenty of evil laughs throughout the entire Nightmare on Elm Street series. In fact, he might be the only slasher villain that really shows much emotion at all. And the emotion that he shows is not anger like you might expect from a horror villain, but instead it's a kind of like sadistic joy. So Freddy not only haunts our nightmares, but he actually loves it. Now, what's really interesting to me is that we also love it when Freddy haunts our nightmares. So all of you just paid money to come to a theater to watch a scary movie, which, if you're someone who studies behavior, like let's say you're studying an animal's behavior, that's kind of a weird thing to do. And that's something that really interests me, and so I study why we sometimes love being scared. And so we'll talk a little more in just a minute about some of my research on morbid curiosity and try to understand why we do like being scared. But first we need to talk about storytelling. So storytelling is a hallmark of human nature. Humans have been telling stories for about as long as language has been around itself. And it's a huge part of every human culture. So for example, one study on topics of conversation among modern hunter-gatherer tribe found that over 80% of nighttime conversations revolved around stories as opposed to anything else. So just as you all just sat around a big flickering screen at night and listened to a story, our hunter-gatherer ancestors also sat around big flickering fires at night and listened to stories. So from hunter-gatherer folklores to fairy tales to modern horror movies, scary stories have also kind of been around forever. And with the bulk of storytelling coming at night, scary stories have always been right at home in human cultures. So for many hunter-gatherer scary stories, these are used to convey dangerous situations in an entertaining and memorable way. So for example, predators are a universal feature of folklore. You find them in folklore across the world and throughout time. So through scary stories, you can sort of rehearse strategies for avoiding or dealing with lethal encounters or threatening situations. And so in this way, stories kind of serve an important social function. But for this to work, people need to be willing to listen to the stories. And in order to be willing to listen to them, they need to enjoy them. Luckily for us, humans love scary stuff. And as many of you are probably aware, horror is often cast as a kind of red-headed stepchild when it comes to entertainment. It's kind of seen as the low bar in the industry, and this can give the impression that maybe it's not widely enjoyed. However, that's pretty obviously not the case. If you simply survey a large number of people, like some colleagues of mine did a few years ago, you'll find that the majority of people do say that they love the horror genre. And of course, any cursory look at pop culture will tell you that horror is widely popular and has been for pretty much as long as there have been records. And part of this may come down to the fact that there's a horror movie for just about everyone. So whether you enjoy gory flicks like Saw and Hostel, or mind-bending horror like Psycho, slashers like Nightmare on Elm Street or Halloween, classics like Dracula, or just a good old-fashioned ghost story or possession story, most people can find at least one subgenre of horror that they do enjoy. So, we know that there are many different kinds of horror. Scary stories have been around for as long as storytelling itself, and when you ask them, most people will say that they do enjoy horror. But we still haven't answered why people seek it out in the first place, or why they enjoy it once they do seek it out. So this is something that some Danish colleagues and I have been trying to work on. We've been trying to answer this question, which is sometimes called the paradox of horror, or why do people scare themselves for fun? And so to study this, we have set up shop at a haunted attraction in Denmark, and we go there every October. And when the guests arrive, we do things like we'll, for example, strap them with heart rate monitors, and we send them through Dystopia Haunted House. And as they fight their way through the onslaught of zombies and evil government officials and chainsaw-wielding pigmen, we captured their facial expressions and behaviors on video cameras that are hidden throughout the haunt. And then, of course, we're collecting their heart rate data, the spikes in the heart rate when they see the monsters or when they're running from the monsters. And then when they leave the haunt, we have them answer some questions. So we'll ask them things like, how scary was it? How much fun was it? How scary was this part as opposed to this part? Which part did you remember the best? And we do this to try to kind of narrow down the paradox of fear and try to answer why people come to somewhere like a haunted house and scare themselves for fun. And so one explanation that we've discovered is that there seems to be a sweet spot for fear where fun is maximized. So in other words, there's a moment at which something is just scary enough that you're able to really enjoy it and kind of toe the line between reality and fiction. And so we pinpointed this using the self-reports after the haunt, but also coding their facial expressions for fear and enjoyment during the scares, and then analyzing their heart rate data during the scariest moments of the haunt. So for example, when heart rate was too high and their faces, just were pure fear, we found that people rated the experiences as a bit less fun. Likewise, when the heart rate was lower and there were no screams on the recordings, people rated the experience as a bit less fun. But there were some Goldilocks moments where screams were followed by laughter, heart rate spiked, but it didn't peak. And these are the cases where people reported the most fun. These are the scares that people said were the most fun. And so now we're getting a bit closer to an answer. So we know that horror stories exist throughout time and across place, that many people today will say that they like horror, and that they tend to like it most when it hits this sweet spot between fear and fun. But we're still missing a crucial why answer. Why horror in the first place? Why not something else? And this is where a lot of my own research and where Morbid Curiosity comes into play. So you can think about Morbid Curiosity as a subconscious motivation to seek out information about threatening or dangerous situations or material. And so the rationale behind this is that the world is a very dangerous place. Our minds are kind of tuned into that, and we often do what we can in order to avoid danger. So this makes quite a bit of sense, for example, from a biological perspective. If you avoid danger, you avoid death. And if you avoid death, you're more likely to pass on your genes to the next generation. So based on my research, there seem to be 4 broad categories that morbidly curious behaviors boil down to. And these categories are mind to dangerous people, paranormal danger, body violations, and interpersonal violence. So let's take a closer look at these 4 dimensions and see where Freddy falls when it comes to each of them. So first up is mind to dangerous people. And this is one that probably everyone is familiar with. This is the basis of true crime. The true crime podcasts, documentaries, and books are wildly popular. And the star of the true crime story is typically the killer. And we love to know why the killer did what he did. That's what most of true crime revolves around. And as this relates to morbid curiosity, the idea is that if you know something about the mind of a dangerous person, you're in a better position to identify and avoid dangerous people in the future. And so what you do is you build a sort of predictive framework that can help you identify future dangerous people based on what you've learned about the behaviors of other dangerous people. And of course, it's much safer to learn about, let's say, a serial killer from a movie, from a TV show, than it is from personal experience. And so you'll see this as kind of a recurring theme when it comes to morbid curiosity. It's always better to maximize your learning potential while minimizing your actual danger. So you want to learn about serial killers, but you don't actually want to necessarily be in front of a serial killer. And of course, again, these are all subconscious motivations, right? People don't explicitly go into these thinking about learning something, or at least they don't usually go into it thinking about learning something. And Freddy makes a strong appearance when it comes to Minds of Dangerous People. After nearly 10 films, you learn quite a bit about Freddy, about his behaviors, about the way he likes to kill people, and you learn that he's a pretty dangerous guy. He boasts a pretty respectable 42 kills across his films. So I think it's pretty safe to say that Freddy satisfies the Minds of Dangerous People dimension of Morbid Curiosity. The second dimension is body violation. And so any number of things can damage our bodies, and damage to our bodies can lead to death. And so in this way, it's important to understand the limits of the human body. And this leads to a fascination or an interest in what the body looks like when it's damaged. So in other words, what are the consequences of dangerous things? So topics that might fall under body violation category are things like an interest in autopsies or amputation procedures, taxidermies, surgeries. And this category is really interesting because, you know, the disgust factors that stem from body violations, which, as we talked about earlier with Freddy's face, they tend to lead to avoidance, and they tend to be repulsive. But, you know, even though you often cringe and you look away, it's important to know something about the body violations, right? It's important to know something about injuries and what they do to the body. And so this tends to pique our curiosity. So after we cringe and look away, we tend to sneak peek back to kind of understand what's happening. And of course, aside from his face, Freddy gives us plenty of opportunities to witness body violations. Of those 42 victims, most of them had pretty dramatic deaths. He tends to make quite a show when he kills his victims. And body violation tends to be on full display in pretty much any nightmare movie that we watch. The third category is interpersonal violence. So though violence, for many people, is scary and produces elements of disgust, blood or sweat, we seem to be drawn to it. And sometimes, this is volitionally, like we pay money to go to MMA or boxing matches. Romans would travel hundreds of kilometers to come to the Coliseum to watch fights. And sometimes it's involuntary. So if you're driving down the road and you see a car wreck on the side of the road, you tend to turn your head and look. If you were walking down the street and a street fight breaks out, most people will stop and turn to watch it, right? Even if it has nothing to do with you. And so violence kind of demands our attention. And it's important for any species, but especially a social species, to know something about violence that's occurring in their environment. And this is why it piques our curiosity. And of course, Freddy displays violence in spades. So it's typically Freddy overpowering his victims, but we do get a glimpse of Freddy meeting a worthy adversary when we see Freddy versus Jason. But in either case, Freddy tends to be a pretty violent individual, and so he tends to draw us in with that aspect of morbid curiosity as well. So the supernatural or paranormal is the final category, and presumably many of the dangers that fall into this category don't actually exist. So, for example, you don't have to believe in ghosts or demons or aliens or anything like that in order to be interested in them, to be afraid of them, or for your mind to perceive them as if they're real. So you don't have to believe in ghosts in order for something to be creepy or spooky. In fact, one thing that's common among ghosts, aliens, monsters, demons, other things that fall into the paranormal or supernatural category, is that they're difficult to directly access or perceive. So even if they did exist, it would be difficult to learn about them. There's an element of the unknown when it comes to dangers about these kinds of things. So with serial killers, we know that they exist, we know that they're dangerous. But with ghosts, it's a little less clear. Is the ghost more like Casper, the friendly ghost, or is something more sinister? Is the alien friendly or ready to destroy the world? And even if we're sure it's dangerous, like the woman on the screen here, we know very little about their behaviors, about their actions, about their strengths or their weaknesses. And our minds value this information as important because it's so rare and because it's so important to know something about it. And this, of course, piques our curiosity. So in the dream world, Freddy's powers are virtually unlimited. He's in many ways a supernatural force when it comes to dreams. His victims, can't really envision the extent of what he can do, and this is how he sneaks up on them, this is how he surprises them. And what's interesting is that among the slashers, Freddy is perhaps uniquely paranormal because he's a dream demon, right? So even though some of the other slashers have kind of a magical or almost a paranormal aspect to them, Freddy really leans into the paranormal or supernatural dimension of Morbid Curiosity. So what have we learned so far? So first, we learned that Freddy haunts your nightmares because he triggers evolved fears. And he does this through his looks and through his behaviors. So for example, we feel disgust by his facial scarring, which taps into our deeply rooted aversions to sources of infection. His glove taps into evolutionarily ancient fears of predators, in particular long teeth and sharp claws. Freddy's behaviors also trigger us psychologically and remind us of how evil and how dangerous he is. So his stalking behavior, for example, is beyond that of even a regular villain or a regular monster. Freddy stalks you in your dreams when you're most helpless and where he has almost unlimited power over you. His incessant laughter at the demise of protagonists reminds us that he's really in it just for the joy. So Freddy is pure evil. He doesn't actually have any kind of ulterior motive other than to harm us because he enjoys it. We also learn that when Freddy haunts our nightmares, we enjoy it because we're morbidly curious creatures. And because Freddy taps into each of these dimensions of morbid curiosity and kind of draws us in to pay attention to what he's doing and to be interested and curious about it. And it makes him a particularly potent stimulus for morbid curiosity because he taps into each of the four dimensions. And there's a bonus. So you might be more resilient because of this. So in a study that was pretty widely covered by the media in this past year, my colleagues and I found that on average, horror fans and morbidly curious people were more resilient during the COVID-19 pandemic. So very early on in the pandemic, we decided to see whether all this sort of fictional training that horror fans have been doing were useful. Like, were people who engage with frightening fiction actually more likely to handle real world stressors better than those people who don't engage in frightening fiction or those people who aren't horror fans? And the answer, at least when it came to the pandemic, was yes. So horror fans were much less likely to report loss of sleep. They didn't report as much anxiety, less depression, less sleeplessness, all these things surrounding basically the stressors of the pandemic. Horror fans were reporting much lower incidences. And likewise, morbidly curious people were reporting a greater ability to enjoy their life during the pandemic, even if they found it difficult and scary, and even if it was impacting. So for example, a lot of morbidly curious people found the pandemic a bit interesting. So even, if they wanted it to end, even if they were afraid of it, they found something interesting about it. They were morbidly curious about it. And this led to a kind of positive resilience. And so one explanation that we offered was that horror fans have learned how to handle acutely stressful situations because they do it for fun all the time. And so all this practice with fear in a safe setting has potentially made you more resilient to fear in the real world. And if the endorsement of science and the media isn't enough, take it from Nancy herself, who agrees that horror fans seem to be more psychologically resilient when it comes to fear. So that is all that I have for you. I'm not sure if we can do a Q&A. I was told that there might be some tech difficulties around that, but if not, please feel free to check out my website. Just Google myname.com. There's a contact form on there. I'd be very happy to answer any questions that you have about the psychology of horror or the psychology of morbid curiosity or anything kind of in that realm.